Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to New Books in Economics, a podcast channel from the New Books Network. I'm Peter Lawrenson, an associate professor of economics at the University of San Francisco. In today's podcast, we'll be talking about the political economy of dictatorship. Political economy started as an area of study within economics when economists started to realize that just because a policy was efficient, that didn't mean a politician would actually implement it. At the same time, political scientists were realizing that the new tools of game theory and statistical analysis that were generating new insights in economics could also be applied to a lot of topics they cared about. Now, initially, most of this research at the intersection of politics and economics concerned democracies, but over the past 30 years, more and more attention has been directed to authoritarian regimes. Our guest today is Meng. Annie is a professor of political science at the University of Virginia, and I had the privilege of working with her while we were both at Berkeley. Her book is called Constraining Dictatorship, From Personalized Rule to Institutionalized Regimes. It was published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press as part of their prestigious series on the political economy of institutions and decisions, and won the William Riker Prize for the best book on political economy. Annie, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Peter. It's good to talk to you again, and thanks so much for having me on the show.
Yeah, great to have you here. So back when we had you at Berkeley, we initially got you started thinking about China and its ruling party. And now you're working on Africa and arguing that parties and autocracies are actually way overrated. So where did we go wrong?
Yeah, I know. I did such a 180. Actually, so I think how I got my start at Berkeley really actually kind of informed me of where I think the literature maybe had some blind spots, and it was really helpful in kind of informing me of where I ended up going with my research. And so, as you mentioned, when I was a grad student at Berkeley, originally I thought I was going to write my dissertation trying to understand the ruling party in China, the CCP, and basically how it became such a strong party. I realized when I was trying to put this project together that to a certain extent, we really were taking party strength for granted. I remember kind of brainstorming my topic with China scholars, and I was getting responses like, "Oh, wow, actually, like we just kind of take the strength of the CCP as given. Like that is an interesting question of like, how did we get there?" And so that kind of inspired me to think about the kind of origins of institutions a little bit more seriously. And simultaneously, I realized that if I really wanted to understand variation in institutional strength, I probably shouldn't study an outlier, right? I realized that I maybe needed to study a lot more cases, and B, I needed to study cases that really kind of ranged in the kind of levels of party strength that they had, instead of focusing primarily on the case that is an outlier that is like one of the strongest parties, which is the case of China. So then that's how I kind of got inspired to still kind of study this question of variation and party strength. But I switched my regional focus to Africa. Because I started working with Leo Ariola at Berkeley, and he just kind of roped me in. He was like, there's a ton of variation in Africa. And so I wrote my dissertation on trying to understand kind of party development and variation in institutional party strength in sub-Saharan Africa. But interestingly, one of the biggest takeaways actually that I got from my dissertation was I actually realized how weak the average ruling party is in your kind of typical autocracy. One of the most interesting descriptive statistics, I think, that really kind of informed a lot of my research was, a simple thing that I did was I counted the number of years ruling parties were able to survive in power past the death or departure of the founding leader. And the vast majority of ruling parties are just not able to survive without its founding leader. It's about 60% of these parties just immediately fall without the leader. So interestingly, after writing a whole dissertation on ruling parties, my biggest takeaway was actually how kind of weak um, most of these parties are. A lot of them are just kind of like empty shells attached to leaders. So that inspired the kind of one other big change and one other big shift in my research focus that kind of culminated in the emphasis of my book, which is I then turned my focus from parties to executive power. Which I think is really kind of the central nexus of power in dictatorships. It's actually like a little bit funny that even though the scholarship on authoritarian regimes has really been kind of reinvigorated since 2000, we don't actually have like a ton of studies that focuses on executive power. Even though dictatorships, one of the kind of defining features of dictatorships is that power is concentrated at the very top, often in one person. So how I ended up kind of focusing on executive power was I was like, I need to just kind of look at the thing directly, right? Look at presidential power and dictatorships and try to understand why, in some cases, executive power becomes limited, and in other cases, it remains very unlimited. And some dictators are able to do largely whatever they want.
Okay,
So yeah, so
wait.
that
So
was
yeah,
yeah.
so maybe to just back up to the big picture and give people context who don't know much about how this study has evolved. Could you maybe just talk us through sort of the evolution of political science thinking about authoritarianism and authoritarian institutions over kind of the bird's eye view over the past sort of 40, 50 years?
Yeah, totally. The evolution of this scholarship is really interesting, actually. So the literature kind of had its first big period around the kind of 50s and 60s, kind of coming out of World War II. And at the time, what's really interesting is, in general, we all thought that dictatorships were kind of like this weird transition period. We political scientists originally thought, kind of assumed, that all countries would ultimately democratize. We thought that that was the kind of endpoint that every country would get to. And we used to think that dictatorships were these kind of like weird flukes, of like interrupted periods in the middle where, a country kind of would fall into a period of dictatorship on its way to ultimately democratizing. And so for a long time, we kind of didn't take dictatorships super seriously. We assumed that institutions that emerged in dictatorships, institutions like constitutions, parties, legislatures, we assumed that it was all just rubber stamp institutions, that they really didn't do anything, they didn't mean anything. And the form of dictatorship that we focused on initially in the kind of 50s and 60s were kind of totalitarian dictatorships, right? So, like Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union. In general, we thought that all dictatorships relied very heavily on kind of like repression to stay in power. So, that was kind of like the first generation of literature. And then the Cold War ended in the early 90s, and we saw a bunch of dictatorships fall, and we thought that like this was it, right? We were like, okay, we're done with dictatorships now. We've entered this like world of democracy, right? Huntington's third wave. And we thought that that was kind of like going to be it with dictatorships. But as time passed, it became obvious that that was wrong, right? Like a lot of these transitions either kind of fell back into dictatorships. Just because a dictatorship falls does not necessarily automatically mean that the next regime will be democratic. A transition from a dictatorship to another dictatorship is actually the most common kind of transition. Furthermore, we kind of slowly started to realize that, the introduction of things that looked democratic, like the introduction of multi-party elections, weren't necessarily unseating incumbents. So this is very true in Africa, where plenty of incumbents from the 80s were able to introduce multi-party elections in the 90s, but still stay in power and kind of, quote unquote, win those elections, right? Like, whether those elections were genuinely free and fair or whether they were kind of being manipulated by the regime. So then that ended up inspiring the kind of next wave of literature. So starting in the early 2000s, and I think that this literature was very much reinvigorated by a very consequential piece by Barbara Geddes, published in 2000, where this kind of next wave of research on dictatorships I think really kind of questioned this assumption that all countries would democratize. So we importantly started to recognize authoritarian regimes as a type of regime that could survive for a very long time. And B, what was really notable about Barbara Geddes's piece was that she highlighted that there are different types of authoritarian regimes. Some regimes rely a lot more on kind of coercive power and repression. Other types of authoritarian regimes rely more on the use of kind of co-optation and introducing, limited amounts of contestation in institutions like parties and legislatures. So I would say that where the research is now is kind of digging even more into these very important observations. And a lot of the new research now really tries to understand kind of variation in the kind of strength and the function of these institutions. And a lot of the research now, I think, is really kind of digging into these different kinds of authoritarian regimes and very much still recognizing autocracy as possibly a very stable form of government. A lot of the research now has also been connecting kind of methods of authoritarian survival with kind of democratic or autocratic backsliding. So I would say that's kind of how the research has evolved over time.
Okay, and so then you come in and you said you were looking at institutions and initially thinking parties were going to be really important, but found they weren't. Actually, one sort of slight side question, but so the people who did the earlier research that did find that having a party was associated with longevity, did they just categorize any regime as a party regime if they had a party, or did they? Because you'd think that maybe there'd be some distinction between kind of what was transparently just a party that's a tool of the one big man versus a party that seems like it has power. But what you're saying is that the majority of these parties really are just, they just kind of vanish as soon as the guy dies or loses power.
Yeah, so I think that there's kind of two things that was going on with the kind of earlier research on parties in the 2000s. So there's two different ways to codify the existence or strength of parties and dictatorship. So one way to do it is what Barbara Geddes did, which is she created these categories of authoritarian regimes, primarily party-based regimes, military dictatorships, and personalist regimes. And she argued that, for the party-based dictatorship kind of type, these are regimes where the party is very strong and there's a lot of kind of collective decision-making. However, I think that a kind of weakness with that approach is that these cases were all hand-coded. And so with hand-coded cases, it's often a bit reliant on kind of like subjective decision making, right? Like how strong does the party have to be to like fall in this category? Different coders might have kind of different expectations or kind of different internal criteria for that. So you end up having a bit of measurement error when you do it that way, right? Furthermore, I've kind of studied these categorizations very carefully, and I think that some of the party-based regimes are probably maybe kind of miscoded because some of them are actually regimes where the party did not survive in power past the founding leader. So, for instance, Sekou Touré, the first president of Guinea, when he was in power, his his regime is coded as a party-based regime by the regime typology framework. So, technically he had a ruling party, the PDG. However, the after Sakatore died of natural causes, but after he died, the military swoops in and takes over power in a coup. Before succession plans could be finalized, they immediately banned the party, and so effectively, they very quickly ended Sakatore and his, PDG regime right after the leader dies. So we definitely have cases like that in terms of the existing coding of party-based regimes. So I do think that there's some measurement error there. The other thing that we have discovered with research that kind of took a second look at this finding that there was this relationship between party-based regimes and regime longevity is that in Ben Smith's article, he has a 2010, I think, World Politics article. He actually shows that if you drop the two longest surviving party-based regimes, Mexico under the PRI and the Soviet Union, then actually the statistically significant result disappears. So he highlights that this finding was probably being driven by two outliers, right? Like two of the strongest cases. The other way to kind of document the existence of parties is the approach that Jen Gandhi took in her work, which was a much more objective way to code parties. So instead of trying to make assessments of how strong the party is, all she did was note whether party activity was kind of allowed in the regime, right? Was there a ruling party? Were there opposition parties? The nice thing about this approach is that it's very objective. We don't have to make any subjective decisions, and it can be replicated. However, so actually what she finds in her book is that she didn't see a relationship between the existence of parties and regime longevity. And I think part of what's going on there is that, most regimes have parties. There really is not a lot of variation in terms of the existence of parties. Virtually all regimes have them. And so that ends up being a little bit too crude of a measure to kind of try to capture any kind of relationship between parties and regime durability.
But then the other measure you're saying was basically because it was subjective, it tended to be colored by kind of the outcomes at some level. And so you tend to code it as stronger if it acted like a strong regime, which is more successful, but then that kind of gets your causality flipped, so you can't really make the claims.
Exactly. It's really hard to code these things, independently, like knowing whether we all kind of like know whether most of these historical regimes survived or not, right? So it's a little bit hard to be like truly unbiased in trying to code the strength of the party. But what I think is really funny is like the fact that this idea that ruling parties are central to regime durability has been such a big argument in the authoritarian regimes literature, yet the empirical support has actually been very kind of shaky this whole time. And so I kind of realized that, and I think that it's kind of interesting. There actually isn't a ton of empirical evidence of the party argument, even though it's been such a big one in the literature.
Okay, so Jen Gandhi with one approach, she said that it looked like parties weren't actually that significant, although with the caveat that almost everyone has some kind of party, at least nominally, so there's not a lot of variation. So she focused more on legislatures. So what's your view on that? Because you argue we should move beyond that as well.
Yeah, so legislatures end up it's a similar argument as the party's argument, where legislatures are actually extremely common in dictatorships as well. Basically, all dictatorships, especially those in the post-Cold War period, dictators have basically learned that a really important survival strategy is that they need to appear somewhat democratic. So, a kind of large argument that I use to set up my book is that nominally democratic institutions, institutions that we associate with democracy, parties, even opposition parties, legislatures, elections, courts, constitutions, all of these things both have been really common in dictatorships and are almost universally present now, especially since the end of the Cold War. So even in the 60s and 70s, 70 to 80% of dictatorships had legislatures. And that percentage, approaches 100% at this point. And so it's just become very common for autocracies to kind of adopt these, pseudo-democratic institutions, but not necessarily give them a ton of independence or power over the executive. But because these institutions have just become so common, they're not super helpful in helping us understand variation in regime durability. Although I do think that an important kind of place for research, and we're seeing a lot of that research now in kind of current work, is to understand variation in the strength of these institutions, right? So some legislatures and autocracies are way more independent and active than others, right? So I know that there's a lot of research looking at the legislature in Vietnam, for instance. Same thing with ruling parties, right? Some parties are a lot more institutionally strong than others. And so I think it's great that like where a lot of the current research is trying to understand variation in these institutions that have become incredibly widespread.
Okay, so you're not just arguing that these are only like window dressing that you put on so that the aid agencies will still donate to you, and the U.S. will be less likely to invade you and try to make you into a real democracy. But you're saying that maybe there's that motivation is there, so that's why pretty much almost 100% of countries, no matter how dirty, at least have that kind of thin veneer going on. But you're saying that. So there is research, which is not primarily what you're doing, but research that is finding that within these categories, like within the countries that have legislatures or parties, there are some that matter more and some that don't matter. But you went in a different direction with your own analysis of institutions. So why don't we talk about that now?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like Ken Apollo is doing a lot of great work trying to study variation in legislative strength in Africa. I think that is really important. And I have been kind of accused of maybe dismissing nominally democratic institutions a bit too much in my book, which I think is a totally fair point to make. I agree with what you're saying, that some of these institutions can be really strong. I just tend to be a bit more kind of skeptical, just because even in places where these institutions have a bit of independence, executive power still looms really huge in most autocracies. Even in the cases in Africa that Ken is looking at, where the legislature does have some independence, they're often battling with these like hugely bloated executive branches. And for some reason, we just haven't studied regime executives as much, for scholars of authoritarian regimes, and hopefully we'll do it some more. But yeah, that's why I turned my focus to that in the book.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think as you said, right, we've sort of, I mean, probably partly just we're kind of studying autocracies. It sort of took the tools and the concepts that we knew from studying democracies, and so there, of course, understanding how the laws are made and who gets into the legislature and who gets seats and all this kind of stuff is really crucial. So it's a natural first thing to look at. But you're right. If we go back to thinking like, right, this is a dictatorship, and our sort of basic reference model for that is like there's one guy who tells everyone what to do, then we should look at more at who that one person is and how they how they tell people what to do and how much. I actually had May Hassan on a few weeks back to talk about her book, which is kind of looking more downstream, looking at the bureaucracy that dictators and other governments had, and how they kind of implement their decisions through the bureaucracy. But you're looking at this at more at the higher level, still at the very elite level of the executive and kind of immediately around him. So so you focus on primarily the policy over succession and term limits. So tell me why we should care about those and what you concluded.
Yeah. So I basically look at two aspects of the regime executive. So the first thing that I do, which is what you just noted, was I looked at a couple of key constitutional rules. Specifically, I was looking at constitutional rules that limit executive power. So the two things that I looked at are term limits and succession rules. So I think term limits are a little bit more intuitive in terms of how they limit presidential power, right? They tell you when a president is, in theory, supposed to step down, although presidents definitely try and succeed to either amend or remove term limits sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
The other kind of constitutional rule that I look at is whether the Constitution has a formal procedure explaining how leadership succession policies will operate in the regime. So the reason why this ends up being a constraint on the executive is that it basically designates a hierarchy, right? It gets rid of this idea that there is one leader, that he is completely irreplaceable, that there is kind of no hierarchy of power, and that there is no replacement for this one leader, right? The way that leadership succession policies often look like in autocratic constitutions is, it'll say if the office of the presidency were to fall vacant, either because of, the death of the leader or illness, or just because the leader is incapacitated, it's the vice president who will become the kind of de facto president. So by kind of naming the succession hierarchy, the kind of person who is the designated successor becomes a very obvious focal point to be the next incoming incumbent, right? And so empirically, this is actually what we see in the cases. So I kind of study leadership succession in the book, as well as I have kind of other articles on it, where I find that the kind of most common type of peaceful leadership succession in Africa is for the designated successor. So whoever gets named in the Constitution, it's most often the vice president. That person usually kind of successfully succeeds the president, either after he dies or after the president kind of, voluntarily leaves office. In fact, the fact that the Constitution kind of designates an alternative leader ends up kind of constraining the president himself, because elites basically have this other person to rally around if the president, isn't holding up his end of the bargain in kind of sharing rents and spoils with them. So just the very kind of act of designating an alternative center of power can be a really powerful type of constraint on executive power. And in fact, we have another term that kind of gets at that in political science, which is the crown prince problem, right? Leaders are often afraid that they're going to be overthrown by their own crown prince, by their own designated successor, precisely because the Constitution is kind of identifying who the next leader is going to be. In addition to constitutional rules, I also look at appointments in the presidential cabinet, which is the kind of highest body of the regime. So specifically, I look to see whether the president is actually appointing elites to two key positions in the regime, in the cabinet. So one is I look at the office of the vice president, and two is I look at the office of the minister of defense. So the idea here is that when presidents appoint other elites as the vice president and as the minister of defense, they are delegating authority, and they're basically handing over access of these incredibly powerful ministries over to another elite.
So what were Actually, let me back up and ask two questions about measurement just to understand like what the alternatives are. So you mentioned like successor policy. I mean, as an American, it just seems to me like, well, of course the vice president would replace the president, and that just seems like, I'd have to actually had to think like, oh yeah, that probably is in the Constitution. And I think I remember there's a list of like other people who would, replace them. But, uh, fortunately, we've never had more than, one assassination at a time. But like the, what is the alternative? Like, is it so people just write a constitution and then they just say he's president and they just don't mention, they presumably mention that this person can be replaced at an election if they're pretending that they have fair elections. So that would be one process of replacement. But you're saying there's no sort of emergency backup
Yes,
option.
that's right. So, in cases where there is no succession procedure in the Constitution, they just don't mention it at all. They don't mention what happens if the dictator were to die or be incapacitated, which, as you can imagine, is really dangerous, right? There's absolutely no backup plan detailed. Another thing that happens, this is kind of much more rare, but it happens sometimes, is the Constitution will have really vague and confusing instructions. So, for instance, I can't remember exactly which country this was anymore, but I remember reading one, kind of supposed leadership succession, rule in the Constitution where they were like, if the president were to die, then, his advisory council will get together and they will talk about it, and then they will figure out the best plan moving forward, right? So, maybe some language about what to do in case the president dies, but no clear indicator of who the successor will be. And so, of course, all the elites are going to end up fighting over who gets to be the interim president, right? So not really solving the collective action problem there.
Right.
It's actually surprisingly common for a lot of leaders to not want to the Constitution to specify succession rules. So, exactly because they're afraid of the crown prince problem, right? So, for instance, the first post-independence president of the Ivory Coast, Houphouët, was kind of like famously afraid of the crown prince problem. And so not only did he not have any formal succession procedures in the Constitution, he actually left the office of the vice president vacant for a long time because he didn't even
Okay.
want to risk
Yeah, I was wondering about that because you
anything, yeah,
mentioned.
anything looking like a de facto successor there in place. So yeah, a lot of leaders are very afraid of doing this.
So the cabinet appointments you mentioned, so the vice president is one, so they just might leave it empty. What and the minister of defense, would they just not appoint anyone to be minister of defense, or they would make themselves minister of defense? How would that
Yeah,
work?
exactly. So, as Americans, well, maybe less so during the Trump administration, but, as Americans, we're used to kind of like healthy, normal, functional cabinets, right? We're used to, just we're used to there being a full cabinet. Everyone's appointed to these positions. They're not constantly being shuffled. That is absolutely not the case with autocratic cabinets. There's a couple of different things leaders can do to not share power with elites. So one strategy is vacancies, right? Yep, there are absolutely cases where a leader just never appoints a vice president, never appoints a minister of defense. Sometimes they get rid of the cabinet position entirely. In a more extreme case, they will also do self appointments. So sometimes leaders will make themselves their own defense ministers or their own vice presidents. My favorite observation in my data set, the most extreme example, was there was a period of time where I think it was the first president of Gabon named himself to a third of all cabinet positions. So there's definitely lots of strategies that leaders take to not give an elite access to these positions. And the reason why appointing elites to these positions is so consequential is not only do you kind of do you visibly demonstrate that you're willing to kind of delegate these important positions to other elites, aka, again, creating a kind of hierarchy where you're not seen as irreplaceable and kind of the only leader that's making decisions. These cabinet positions are really powerful. They come with a ton of resources, even just beyond the kind of lucrative salaries, cars, housing. They come with a ton of government contracts as well, and just a lot of monetary resources that allow these elites to kind of consolidate their own power base, and kind of, get their own supporters by being able to, for instance, hand out these government contractors to their own allies, right? And so power is really being kind of shifted and shared with elites when the leader delegates these positions to other people.
So there's no sort of loyalty story here at all. I'm just thinking like in the China politics literature, there's definitely maybe not so much at the very tip top elite levels. That may be one difference, but like there's a lot of people who've done a lot of work to sort of classify like who appointed whom, and then they assume, well, if you appointed someone to a position, then they owe you and they'll be loyal to you. You have a special relationship. It's either caused by you doing the appointment, or maybe the fact that you appointed them reveals that you were connected. But you're kind of saying that it's, if not the opposite, but just that maybe there is no loyalty among those top leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. My perspective is that it actually really sucks to be a dictator. Dictators really have no friends. I get this question a lot, right? Where it's like, well, isn't it just safer for the leader to like name his friends or his family members, or, in Africa, his co-ethnics is kind of like, an important in-group. But empirically, when we look at the data, dictators are overthrown by their so-called friends all the time. It's actually very common for leaders in Africa to be overthrown by their co-ethnics. In fact, co-ethnics actually have a higher rate of successfully deposing the leader. Also, leaders are deposed by family members all the time. We see this not just in Africa, but in kind of European monarchies, it was very common to be overthrown by a brother, a cousin. Within sub-Saharan Africa, there's actually more cases of a leader being deposed in a coup by a family member than a leader successfully passing on power to a family member, right? And so these kind of so-called friendships or relationships that you would think are kind of like safe and loyal, really actually break down when you put people, near the very apex of power, right? And you kind of like dangle the possibility of being the top dog to them. A lot of these loyalties disappear very quickly.
I guess that makes sense. I mean, you mentioned you can even call it the crown prince problem. And typically the crown prince is the son of the king, but once he decides his dad's getting old and needs to be replaced, but doesn't want to step down, then he may his family loyalties may decline.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so all this sounds like a great reason why, if I'm the dictator, I should make sure not to, I feel like I'm curious about the history, but that's a little sidebar. But I imagine you probably actually have to like go and delete that section from your draft constitution about like what happens when I die, because most functioning constitutions, and usually everyone starts by at least copying the basic structure from someone else, would actually mention the successor policy. Term limits, obviously that different countries have different opinions about that, so that's not as much of an active decision. But the successor policy is maybe an active decision, and then obviously to not bother to appoint anyone to a crucial cabinet position or the vice presidency. That all, you've made a good argument for why, as a dictator, you shouldn't do that. So why does anyone do that?
Yeah. So what I argue in the book is that some dictators, especially those that come to power really weak, end up kind of being forced to have to make these concessions. When a leader comes into power initially weak and is at a very high risk of being deposed by his fellow elites, they end up having to find ways to credibly share power with his fellow elites, so that they basically are getting enough goodies to remain a supporter of the leader and of the regime. So the reason why these cabinet appointments and also kind of codifying access to these high level offices through constitutional rules like the leadership succession rules and term limits, the reason why this is a really good vehicle for these weak leaders to maintain support of elites is because they actively shift political power into the hands of these elites. So this is a really big theme in my book, which is, it's not necessarily enough just to kind of put some rules down on paper. It's about whether these rules that are created actually empower and give resources to specific elites. So I think that the kind of cabinet appointments is a really good illustration of this. When an elite gets appointed to a cabinet position, not only do they get the kind of influence and prestige of being, the Minister of Defense, they also are able then to control all of the resources associated with that ministry. Given that coups are the most frequent way in which leaders are overthrown, controlling the military by being the Minister of Defense is very, very important, right? So that is a huge kind of, giveaway that the president is giving to the elite who's appointed as the Minister of Defense.
But that's so let me just interrupt. Sorry. That's kind of an outcome or maybe an intermediary step, right? So you're giving more power to this other person. I was wondering with the, some of the pushback, especially in authoritarian regimes, about analyzing any kind of formal institutions, or especially like rules on paper, is that, in a dictatorship, who cares what the rules are on paper, right? You have this successor policy, you have these term limits, you also have like free, I'm sure you've promised to have free and fair elections and freedom of speech and all these other things. There's lots of lovely stuff in that constitution, but if what really matters is like how powerful that top guy is and what deals he's struck with other people in the system. So how do you respond to that in arguing that still this successor policy and term limits is still an important measure of power that's been given up?
Yeah, this is a great question. So not all constitutional rules are equally powerful, right? So one distinction that I make between succession rules and term limits, actually, and this is a distinction I make in the book, is that I argue that term limits ends up constraining leaders way less than succession policies. So the logic here is that succession policies, what it does is it actually designates um, it designates a specific elite as an alternate leader, as kind of an alternate center of power, right? So when a succession policy says, for instance, the vice president is the designated successor, every elite in the regime knows that the vice president is most likely going to be the next leader. So then the president ends up needing to contend with this other person who everyone kind of has built their expectations on as the future incumbent. This is very different from term limits, especially constitutions that have term limits but no succession procedures, because term limits are just kind of an open promise to step down, right? But then what happens if the leader violates these term limits and doesn't step down? If there aren't successor policies in place, elites actually don't know who the next leader would have been. And so the elites kind of don't know who's losing out the most, right? Would I have been the next leader? It's actually not sure. And so something like that, which is a lot more vague in kind of laying out the hierarchy of power, ends up not kind of solving the elite collective action problem. And so that's kind of an example of how succession procedures shifts power in favor of the designated successor, but term limits without succession procedures really don't kind of identify a hierarchy and doesn't empower a specific elite. So it's really about the content of these rules that should help us judge whether these are just kind of words on paper or whether specific elites are becoming empowered.
Okay, and so with those measurements, then what do you actually you mentioned you have a sample of basically all or most of sub-Saharan Africa for most of the period of independence. And what do you find? What are the key results that you get from that?
Yeah. So kind of connecting this with your earlier question about why would a leader ever share power? I argue that it's these kind of initially weak leaders who would be overthrown by regime elites in the absence of a credible commitment to share power with them. These are the types of leaders who end up being kind of forced to have to implement these constitutional rules, and these are the kinds of leaders who have to allow elites to take over as vice president, minister of defense, other key minister positions. On the other hand, leaders who come to power already extremely strong and face basically no risk of being overthrown, these strong leaders really don't need to do anything to make sure they stay in power, right? Strong leaders have already consolidated power. They really face no real threat from other elites. So why would they give away the goodies of the regime, right? These are leaders who would love to just serve as their own minister of defense and vice president and minister of finance and collect all of the rents associated with those offices themselves instead of sharing it with elites. And when leaders come into power already strong, they really don't need to worry about elites complaining, right? They can do whatever they want, and elites are just already in a kind of a very weak position. So this is basically what I see when I look at the data. So I kind of approach measuring leader strength in a couple of different ways. So I basically, so my argument is about the kind of initial strength of the leader, right? What kind of position are they in when they first take power? So my measurement strategy is to basically look at the ways in which leaders came into power as a way to kind of get at how powerful they are relative to other elites at the start of the regime. So there kind of isn't one perfect way to do this, but I kind of, I kind of approximate it in a couple of different ways. So one thing that I do is I basically compare founding leaders against kind of leaders that took power later. So founding leaders usually come into office in a position of strength. So founding leaders are basically the kind of the first leader to come into power in Africa. These were, largely kind of post-independence leaders who took power kind of immediately after independence was granted. These founding leaders were seen as, very legitimate. They're kind of known as the quote founding fathers of the regime. They're very popular. There's usually a lot of kind of initial excitement after independence is first granted. So these leaders came into power much stronger compared with leaders that kind of took office later, decades later. The other reason why the kind of non-founding leaders, the kind of successor leaders, often were much weaker autocrats is actually by design. So leaders will often purposefully appoint weak elites as their successor because they're afraid of the crown prince problem, right? They don't want their successor to overthrow them. So it's actually very common for presidents to designate a weak successor, a weak elite as their designated successor. So a lot of these successors were actually quite weak by design. So what we see is that founding leaders compared to kind of successors or just kind of leaders that came into power later, founding leaders are less likely to have formal constitutional succession rules. They definitely didn't have term limits. And they were also less likely to appoint elites to these key positions in the cabinet. Another strategy that I kind of used to compare leader strength was I focused on the kind of subset of post-independence leaders. So just looking at this kind of group of leaders that took power immediately following independence in these African states. out of that subset of post-independence leaders, I argue that there's basically two types of leader. On one hand, there was the kind of leader of like a mass independence movement who kind of started this movement in the years prior to independence being granted. They were leaders of these kind of big grassroots movements that really fought for independence. These leaders tended to have a lot of legitimacy going in. So, examples of this is the first president of the Ivory Coast, or the president of Guinea. These were just like, very kind of pro-independence mass movement leaders.
Right, that kind
These
of
types
personal
of
charisma and
exactly.
national hero. So you've told us about these strong leaders, the national heroes. Now tell us about who comes in who's weak. Where do they come from? How do they even get power if they're so weak?
Yeah, so the other kind of post-independence leader, who I argue are much weaker, are basically leaders that essentially inherited their position from the outgoing colonial authorities. So we see this in the case of Cameroon, for instance. We see this in Botswana. The first post-independence president was not this like nationalist leader. They actually tended to kind of be bureaucrats from the former colonial state. These kinds of leaders were basically kind of pushed by the colonial authorities to be the new leader. And they're often seen as basically kind of like, cogs in the colonial machine. They're seen as being kind of close allies of the outgoing colonial authorities, which honestly is sometimes a bit of an accurate perception, right? So the first president of Cameroon, Ahijo, the outgoing French authorities like actually wanted him to be the president and actually kind of like heavily promoted him to be the first independent president because they knew that he would maintain very kind of close relations with France. And he did. And so these kinds of leaders who inherited their positions tend to be very weak when they first take power. They tend to be highly unpopular, and they tend to get a lot of pushback actually from kind of other elite factions within the regime. So these are the kinds of kind of post-independence leaders that are very weak. So what I see in the data is, again, kind of consistent with my argument, which is the kind of founding nationalist leaders, the kind of founding fathers who really had these mass movements. They were less likely to have formal succession rules, less likely to kind of make these elite appointments in the cabinet, versus leaders that inherited their positions but were very unpopular and very weak when they did take power. They did end up having to kind of make these concessions a lot more by appointing elites to these cabinet positions, and having to kind of make these concessions just to maintain support from fellow elites.
So why make a concession through a cabinet appointment? Why not just like build that person a hospital in their hometown, or give them some money, or control over an oil well, something like that? Why actually give them political power that can be used against you so easily?
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to the theme that I was talking about like really needing to kind of shift power and empower specific elites. So, the alternative of kind of empowering elites and giving them access is to try to what we call, do like a per period payment, right? Basically kind of, give someone a bag of money, right? Which is the equivalent of just kind of like, building a hospital in their area or giving them kind of temporary access to kind of like streams of revenue. The reason why these kinds of kind of temporary payments end up not being very helpful to stabilize a regime is because elites know that these are temporary streams of revenue that can be cut off very easily by the leader, right? So, if I'm an elite and I'm a threat to the leader today, and he just kind of gives me temporary access to money, I know that if tomorrow, if I unfortunately kind of lose my edge over the leader, and he's just kind of giving me these temporary payoffs, then he can cut off access to these spoils, and then I would be left in a very bad position tomorrow. The reason why these kind of government appointments end up being a way more kind of credible way to share spoils is precisely because they actually empower these elites, right? When the president names an elite to an important cabinet position, and especially if they keep that elite there for long periods of time. So I also look at kind of rotation rates. These elites end up kind of gaining authority over these specific ministries, right? Not only are they kind of getting spoils associated with this government position, they control a very important piece of the state. And in empowering them, it makes it a lot harder for the leader to just kind of stop paying them tomorrow, or to just kind of, immediately remove them from a position if, for instance, they've been in charge of the military for a really long time. So precisely because these cabinet appointments end up empowering elites and shifting power, that's what makes these promises a lot more credible.
Right. So yeah, you can't trust a guy you can give someone money, but they can't trust that they'll continue to have it as long as you still hold the gun in some sense. So you have to
Exactly.
give them access to some a way to strike back at you. So and then what do you see going forward? So do these institutional changes? You talked about where they come from and how do they play out later?
Yeah, so in terms of kind of whether these institutions have any consequences for both leader and regime stability, I find that they do, but there's kind of a small caveat, right? So a big question that the kind of scholarship on authoritarian regimes has really tried to focus on is whether institutions actually have an effect on leader or regime durability, right? So what I argue here is yes, having these cabinet appointments and having these constitutional rules do end up stabilizing the regime. However, and here's where the second half of the book really, I'm sorry, here's where the first half of the book really informs the second half of the book. We have to think about who's putting these institutions in place in the first place, right? So what I have argued is that it's these weak leaders who have to institutionalize and grant elites these cabinet positions and create these constitutional rules. Strong leaders can stay in power no matter what they do, right? It's kind of irrelevant. So what I argue is when we want to think about the consequences of these institutions on durability, we need to account for whether the leader who created them was strong or weak in the first place. So, what I find is that for leaders who are weak, when weak leaders put in place these institutions like cabinet appointments or constitutional rules, it does end up lengthening their regime and stabilizing the regime. So these types of weak leaders who do institutionalize end up facing fewer coups compared with weak leaders who don't create these institutional commitments with elites. However, what I find consistent with my earlier argument is that these institutional creations or the absence of them really don't affect strong leaders. There are plenty of strong leaders who come into power already, having basically consolidated power. There is no real elite threat. These kinds of strong leaders end up not creating these institutional constraints, and they're able to stay in power for a really long time. So that's kind of conventionally what we understand to be like a personalist dictatorship, right? They don't create succession rules. They, name themselves their own cabinet ministers. Some of these leaders are able to stay in power for a really long time, for decades, right? Think about like Mobutu in Zaire. Consistent with my argument, we really have to take into account the kind of relative strength of the leader when assessing whether institutions have an effect on leader or regime strength.
Okay, so well, we're running a little short of time. I wanted to, before we close off, I wanted to ask you to stretch your argument and humor me by thinking a little bit about China. And so I shared with you that just this morning, someone called my attention to a quote from a book by the investor Ray Dalio, who's been a big, very bullish on China and argued that it's really this great meritocratic system, and a great place to invest, like he has, and all that. And he says. There's a quote from his book saying, "Make sure that no one is more powerful than the system or so important that they are irreplaceable. For an idea meritocracy, it is especially important that its governance system is more powerful than any individual and that it directs and constrains its leaders rather than the other way around. The Chinese leader Wang Qishan drew my attention to what happened in ancient Rome when Julius Caesar revolted against the government, defeated his fellow general Pompey, seized control of the republic from the Senate, and named himself emperor for life. Even after he was assassinated and governance by the Senate was restored, Rome would never again be what it was. The era of civil strife that followed was more damaging than any foreign war." Now, apparently, this gets Rome's history completely wrong, but it does seem kind of consistent with your argument, right? That there's it can, even if you have a strong leader in power for some period of time, if they undermine or never create institutions that would constrain them, then the subsequent conflict and instability might actually be worse. But it's also particularly amusing because, of course, the biggest elite level political development in China in the past few years has been that the top leader Xi Jinping has said, or has made it happen, that there will not be any term limits on him. He's he's removed the formal term limits on himself as president, and then also has chosen not to appoint any focal successor, which was, again, something that all the China experts in the media and in academia were all saying, "Oh, look, here's this great thing. He's, there's basically a 2-term limit, and there's a designated successor." So he's gotten rid of all that. So what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, so I think that thinking about China through the lens of my argument is really interesting. So what's really interesting about China is that they had the constitutional term limits. But what's really interesting is that leadership succession was actually governed by norms. Is that right? I don't think there were formal rules written down. Is that right, Peter?
That's right. It was pretty much just understood that there would be a person who would be in the vice presidency and then would be if you were in the vice presidency in the term immediately prior to the other person having to step down, then you'd be the one who would be chosen as president at the next set of national meetings. But the national meetings themselves, in principle, would be like an open vote. It was just understood that you were the focal choice, and everyone was going to choose you.
Yeah, so I think it's actually quite remarkable that China has undergone so many peaceful transitions, given that given that succession was kind of reliant on these norms, right? Although I think it's really important to note that the first leadership transition from Mao to Deng was very messy. And I mean, I think it was a really, really dangerous time for the regime, right? Like quite possibly one of the most dangerous periods for the regime. That transition could have totally fallen apart, right? And I think that we kind of think of China now as this like highly, structured, highly institutionalized regime. But I think it's important to remember that the regime under Mao was very personalist. And things really didn't start to become more institutionalized until the decades after that initial kind of leadership transition. So I think that going back to the fact that it's kind of incredible that China has been able to experience multiple peaceful leadership transitions, without these kind of formal rules on paper. So I do see a couple of cases where in sub-Saharan Africa, so Tanzania comes to mind, where the leadership transitions actually kind of didn't go according to what was written down. So in Tanzania, for instance, the vice president is the designated successor. But what's really interesting is that the ultimate successors who took power were actually not the vice president. So, however, they still ended up being peaceful. So in these kind of like small number of cases where either there just wasn't a formalized constitutional rule regarding succession, or the regime was able to have peaceful succession without by deviating from the rules, like Tanzania. Usually these are the cases where there was a really strong ruling party to kind of settle disputes within elites, right? So we also see this actually in the PRI in Mexico, where succession was also kind of norm based. There actually weren't formal constitutional rules about succession written down, and the president would kind of choose the next successor informally, and they were able to have many peaceful leadership transitions that way. But I think these are all cases where the regime actually did have a party that was strong enough to kind of be able to adjudicate, elite infighting without having to write it down. But I will say, I think messing with succession procedures is just generally really dangerous. I think that that's where a lot of regimes fall, actually. Because when you mess with succession procedures, the person who thought that they were going to be the head honcho next is really losing out a lot, right? And not only that person, but everyone else under them, right, who was like getting ready for this like new alignment, who thought that they were going to have a sweet position in the next regime, they're also losing out too, right? And so, messing with succession is often a really, really dangerous thing. So I'd be really curious to see what happens moving forward with Xi. I think that I honestly think that, getting rid of term limits is actually kind of less dangerous for him than if he were to really try to mess with succession.
Yeah, well, I guess that's but yeah, he definitely hasn't and like you said, there was never like a formal rule about like who, or if there is a formal rule, it was never that important, but like about who was replacing him. But then it's just been understood, and it was quite informal. Like Deng Xiaoping pretty much chose. First of all, he had two successors in the 80s, both of whom he kicked out of power after he decided that they were, not going to work out for whatever reasons. And then he picked Jiang Zemin, and more or less at the same time, picked Hu Jintao to succeed him. And so then Hu Jintao was sitting in waiting for over 10 years. And then he got to have his turn. And then 6 years or 5 years into his term, then they were able to, then Xi Jinping kind of came as a little bit of a surprise, and was anointed as the next vice president. And that was actually, before then, there hadn't even been this whole like 5-year, 10-year cycle. And so it just barely kind of got started. And then I think we all jumped on it and said, aha, now they're super institutionalized, and their elites are going to always transition according to this nice, clean system that will avoid conflict. And then just as soon as we all started saying that, they then had Xi pretty much just threw the whole thing out the window. But yeah, how that'll actually play out is remains to be seen.
Do you think that we were too quick to call China like a very institutionalized system? Do you think it's actually less institutionalized than we thought, the regime?
I think there's a lot going on institutionalized within the party, but I think we definitely were too hasty in thinking that the succession was going to follow this nice, tidy, formal procedure, especially because it was an informal institution. It wasn't that it had to go exactly that way. And they'd added term limits to the presidency, but the party secretary, which is really the most important role, I guess, did not have term limits. So there was always a little bit of ambiguity about that. It seemed like they were lining up to something nice and clean, but I mean, in terms of actually fully following this thing that we were suggesting was a permanent institution, they only really did it for 10 years. And normally when we think about institutionalization, we kind of want, just as like you said, if you want to measure whether a party's strong, you have to kind of measure whether it lasts past the first leader. And if we want to measure whether a country's democratic, we don't just look at whether they've had some elections, but we look at whether there's been actually orderly transfer of power from one party to another. And I think there's a similar thing where, it can be risky to rush to judgment about whether something's institutionalized if it hasn't really happened on a regular basis for a significant period of time. Even and most importantly, I guess, like within democracies, like even where it involves a transfer of power from from one group to another, which then may be reluctant to transfer power back or onward when it's their turn. But anyway, that's just, I didn't want to take us too far off on Africa, but I do want to get your view on that. I think, in a sense, where we started off with this is, you getting started thinking about Africa did have a lot to do with, being trained in political science techniques and saying, well, we need to compare against various alternatives. And of course, those of us who work on China tend to think so much about China, we don't even know, like, how do any other countries do it? We have, we studied a little bit about the old Soviet Union, and we kind of like hear some things from our colleagues, but it tend to be less broadly versed in some of the statistical and empirical realities across countries than other places. And certainly that's even, if anything, even more so among the kind of journalistic and commentary class who talk about China. Tends to be very, everyone feels proud about whether they do or don't know like 3,000 years of history and can name a whole bunch of emperors or something. But in terms of like what happened with, Ufui Wenyi in Africa, that's not something anyone feel embarrassed all about knowing nothing about, even though it's probably more relevant than something that happened in the Han Dynasty. Anyway, but that's just my little soapbox, and I'm vulnerable to that as much as anyone. Well, just the last thing, just a couple minutes. Tell me what you're working on next, and then we'll sign off from there.
Yeah. So my next big project that I'm actually kind of just jumping into now is basically the opposite of this first project. My first book thinks about how executive constraints get created, and my new project is going to think about how executive constraints get weakened or removed. So basically, just the opposite of this first project. And the way that I kind of got there was, I was very aware that an assumption that I was making with the first book is that, and I think that this is an assumption that actually a lot of us make in the kind of literature on authoritarian institutions, is that, when an institution is created, we kind of assume that we're done, right? Like, an executive constraint is created. Okay, great. It's there forever. Empirically, though, that's not the case, right? Like sometimes term limits get removed. There's been evidence of that in the news. Sometimes succession procedures get changed, altered, or removed. So I kind of left the first book knowing very well that I was making this assumption about the kind of permanence of institutions. And so I really wanted to kind of pick up on that assumption in the second book and try to understand kind of when that's true and when it's not, right? Like, when does an institution, after it's created, when does it last and remains untouched? Versus, under what conditions can leaders try to remove these existing constraints on their power? What I'm really excited about actually is that for the second book now, whereas the first book just collected data on sub-Saharan Africa, the data set for the second book is actually going to be global. So my RAs just helped me finish collecting the same kinds of variables, constitutional rules, cabinet appointments, but on a global set of 120 something countries from 1960 to 2020. So I'll be able to kind of have a much more global perspective in the second book. And I'm also really excited that the data is kind of much more updated and basically goes up until just 1 or 2 years ago. And I'm hoping that the book will also speak to this kind of emerging scholarship on democratic and autocratic backsliding, since I'll be focusing on kind of executive aggrandizement.
Yeah, I guess we've heard a lot more about democratic backsliding, partly because we've worried about it a lot in the U.S. and in many other countries. But that's a great point. That I guess as in the example of Xi Jinping, there's even autocrats can wipe away some of these institutions and make them and bring even more power into their own hands, which is certainly an important phenomenon worth keeping track of, and worth another thing that leads us away from just the simple kind of dichotomous thinking or of like that the only thing interesting about dictatorships is when will they democratize and how soon, but understanding really how they function and all the many things that happen within them that may or may not have any long run connection to democratization.
Yeah, absolutely. And another big theme that's come out of my work is that there is a lot of talk about democratic backsliding, but I think that one of the big ideas that actually I think can might be a little bit controversial that came out of my first book is that a lot of cases that we thought were cases of democratization are, and this is especially true in Africa in the 1990s, these were actually instances of autocratic institutionalization, right? So the most important change that happened when the Cold War ended was not necessarily that these countries, adopted democratic looking elections. By the way, they're often very much manipulated. It's that these dictators learned that they really can't rule alone, and that won't be stable, right? These dictators learned that the best way to be a stable autocracy is to kind of make these institutional pacts with other elites, and have a regime that's based more on kind of joint rule. And a lot of times we kind of misunderstood that as moves towards democratization, when really that was moves toward stable autocracy. So I think one of the themes that's going to kind of appear in this new project is, we're like freaking out about so-called democratic backsliding, and because we have this assumption that like once a country democratizes, it's supposed to remain a stable democracy forever. We really need to take a step back and think about whether these were real instances of democratization in the first place, right? A lot of these cases were actually instances of the kind of more sophisticated form of institutionalized autocracy. And so, this idea that some of these leaders would then be able to kind of, centralize or personalize power, given that they're autocracies, should be maybe a little bit less surprising and shocking to us now. So it's really just kind of how you're thinking about it, and whether you think you're seeing a democracy or an autocracy. And I think that we need to kind of refine our views about what the modern day autocracy looks like. It looks a lot closer to a democracy than you might think.
Great. Well, on that note, yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing your work. Again, for people listening, the title of your book is "Constraining Dictatorship," and everyone should definitely rush out and get a copy, because we just managed to sort of skim the surface of a lot of the topics in there. And yeah, hope to hear more from you very soon.